Brilliant. Okay, thanks a lot, Meg. And thank you to everyone for coming along to today's session. Great to see so many of you here. My name is Robbie Love, and I'm a lecturer in English language here at Aston. I just want to check that my screen is sharing. Can you see my slides? Yeah, okay, great, good. I want to start with an apology to Dan Clayton, who I can see is here, because he's seen me give this talk at least once, possibly twice before already. So I do apologize, Dan, for that. My video has just gone off, has it? What's happened there? Can you still see me?
I'm so sorry about that, Rob. I'm so sorry about that, Robbie. I'm not used to Zoom, and I think I accidentally stopped your video. So
that's fine.
I apologise. I was trying to stop my own.
It's probably for the best to turn mine off anyway. You don't have to look at me.
I'm so sorry.
Everything else still working. You can see
everything else.
screen.
Great. Yeah, it was just me. I was trying to stop. Sorry.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I want to talk about some of my research into swearing, which, you know, I think it's fair to say often gets kind of an interesting reaction. People have very strong feelings about swearing one way or the other. And certainly I think considering its role in the A-level English language classroom, if any, is, I think, a really interesting question to ask. And really, I approach this from the perspective of the fact that many people in life learn how to swear, but they're never necessarily explicitly taught how to do it. And yet it performs a really useful range of functions in life through language. And so more broadly, a lot of my research into spoken English is interested in contemporary change in language. And of course, as a descriptivist linguist, I come from the perspective that change is natural and inevitable part of looking at language over time, and that it is neither necessarily a good thing nor a bad thing. And so I try not to shine a value judgment upon any changes that are observed, but rather simply observing change to help us understand language better, more broadly. And so we can look at different levels of language change and different areas from different linguistic perspectives. But of course, what's also interesting is that attitudes around change, and in this context specifically change in swearing, is also really interesting to look at. As I said, linguists tend to prefer to describe neutrally or relatively neutrally changes that might be happening, whereas in the public, with a lot of areas of language, and swearing is no exception, you get quite a lot of strong opinion. I'll be touching on that as well. So from the perspective of how to actually look at change, and specifically with swearing in mind as an example of, you could say, lexical change, but also it demonstrates semantic change and also grammatical change. We come from the perspective that we observe how language is actually used. So it's not about me saying, well, I'm a linguist, and so therefore this is the best swear word, and these are the ones that you shouldn't use, and X, Y, and Z. It's not about my opinion, but rather it's about observing the data, so to speak, the linguistic data in the world around us. And we try to do that from a functional perspective, trying to actually work out how are people using the language that they use to achieve certain communicative goals. And so we take evidence of language being used out there in the real world, so to speak, although I cringe a bit when I use that term. And if we're looking at change, then we can compare across different points in time and look at the differences and the similarities and try and work out how things are changing over time. And the way that I do this, and a lot of other linguists do this nowadays, is through corpus linguistics, which is using computer software to study patterns in usually relatively large principled collections of language data. And so a couple of definitions for you in terms of corpus linguistics and what it is when we use a corpus. A set of machine-readable text, which is deemed an appropriate basis on which to study a specific set of research questions. So when we're thinking about a corpus. It's not just any old text, but rather a set of texts that has been selected specifically and designed with the purpose of studying language, studying some systemic patterns or variation in language. And this is typically the kind of thing, or one of the things that we might end up doing, is looking at the usage of a particular word or phrase in a data set and analyzing the patterns that we notice in terms of repeating patterns of meaning or co-occurrence between different words, known as collocation. And we also use frequency to inform our observations quite a lot. Frequency is very intuitive and appealing because, of course, we can say, well, this word used to be used at this rate, and now in this more recent corpus, it's gone down or up. Therefore, there might be something interesting because there is clearly a relationship between what is salient to us linguistically and the frequency that we use certain words. And that is really an important part of my work in swearing, looking at the frequencies of different swear words. As I said, I focus in a lot of my work on spoken English, spoken British English to be specific, and even more specifically, casual conversation. So I work with data sets that contain transcripts of recordings of people having casual conversations with each other. And so you ask people to record themselves chatting among their friends and families in what would otherwise be a private setting. So maybe in the home, maybe around the dinner table, maybe sat in front of the TV, out for a walk, in the car, in a restaurant, places like that. And they get transcribed so that they can be searched using computer software. And if you end up with quite a lot of these samples of recordings and the transcript, then you can start to try and make some observations about language more generally. So the kinds of questions that we ask quite broadly are, how do speakers use language in these, if you want, authentic speech situations, and how is this changing in recent years? And so one of the corpora that I use a lot is a corpus I had a hand in building for my PhD, which is the new version of the Spoken British National Corpus. That contains 11 million words of the transcribed casual conversation. And we can compare this with the original version, which was built in the 1990s, to give us a sense of what might have changed since the 90s and between the 90s and 2010s, which is relatively contemporary in the grand scheme of looking at language change when, of course, the A-level spec takes you all back to early modern English, for instance. So last few decades is relatively contemporary in the grand scheme of things. Although, of course, spoken language, particularly casual speech, does change, at least at the lexical level, so quickly that there will be things that have happened even in the last few years that won't be captured by this data even then, because things do change so quickly. So, swearing. I became interested in swearing on the basis of some research that my PhD supervisor at the time had previously published. And I decided I wanted to sort of carry on with the sort of work that he had done on the original BNC. And so I got interested in studying swearing that way. I was about to say I got interested in swearing. I'd been interested in swearing myself for a long time already before that, but I hadn't researched it before, and I thought it would be interesting to look at this. And I published a paper on this last year that was, I suppose I should have expected to an extent. Journalists and the press quite like this kind of thing. They like these stories. And because I was able to produce lists, which are very easily interpretable, top 10 swear words in one time period and top 10 swear words in the other time period, a lot of journalists jumped on it and put out these sorts of stories. And it was really interesting to see some of the reactions to these stories. And I'll show you some of the comments that we received on newspaper articles in a moment. Swearing, as I mentioned before, isn't just about causing offense. That's often what is kind of, if someone, what's swearing? Well, it's naughty words that can be hurtful. Well, yeah, potentially they can be, but actually there's so much more to it than that. And research shows that swearing performs a really wide range of functions which go far beyond, and in fact, in some cases, nothing at all to do with causing offense, usually for social bonding, humor, etc. And my argument is that even though it might be an area of language that isn't traditionally taught, like we teach grammar, for instance, it is part of language. We can't deny that. And so it's worthy of study, just like any other part of language. So let's take a closer look. And it probably goes without saying, but here comes some swearing. I said this, that yes, it's usually about offensiveness, but there are other functions that we can identify. And also, interestingly, a lot of the swear words in English, and actually this is I wouldn't say universal, but very common. A lot of them relate to taboo subjects like sex and bodily functions specifically, but also religious-related swear words come up too. But a lot of the English swear words can be boiled down to those two main areas of sex and bodily functions. And what's interesting about swearing is that we know that the brain behaves differently when we swear. There have been scientific studies by people far cleverer than I, who hook up all sorts of equipment to people's brains and fingertips and all sorts of stuff, and get them to say swear words and then get them to say non-swear equivalents. So saying, fuck, and then saying the F word or fudge instead. And when you say a word like fuck instead of fudge, for instance, something different happens in your brain. We know that the brain is very conscious of the taboo status of certain subsets of words in our vocabulary. And so for all of these reasons, I think if we are on board with the idea that swearing can be considered a legitimate part of language, then this opens the doorway for loads of really interesting investigations and questions that we can ask. And these are questions that researchers are addressing, but also questions that I would argue A-level students could ask as well. So we can look at, going out there and measuring swearing, counting swearing. That's the sort of work that I do that I'll show you in a moment. But we could also look from more of a sociological perspective at opinions about swearing and language regulation and legislation around swearing. There are lots of rules in many different contexts in public life about when it is and isn't allowed to swear. And so there's a lot, I think, that we can get into here. Anyway, here are the swear words that I looked at. So there's 16 of them. As you know, I'm sure there are many, many others. But I wanted to choose swear words that I considered to be fairly consistently used as swear words, as opposed to words that are polysemous with non-taboo meanings. And the first thing I noticed was actually that the frequency, when you put them together as a set, had decreased between the 90s and the 2010s, these two data sets that I mentioned, which may seem sort of alarming at first, but actually still falls within the kind of rate that you typically observe in studies of swearing. Around about 0.2, 0.3, 0.4% of lexical output on average is swearing, which might not sound very much, but actually, because of the output of words across someone's day or week or month or however long you want to measure, 0. anything percent is still actually quite a lot relatively. More interestingly, these three words, fuck, shit, and bloody, are by far dominant, and the other forms I looked at are much, 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 much less common, and that's the case for both time periods. The difference is in the ranking, which has changed. And so this is the ranking for 1990s, and you can see bloody is all the way up there at the top, over 600, nearly 650 hits per million. So this is a rate, it's not a raw count, it's a relative frequency. Followed by fuck, and then shit, piss, bugger, etc. Much, much, much less frequent. Then look at the 2010s. Fuck, shit, and bloody is still the top three, but the order has changed. Bloody has plummeted to less than 150 per million, so it's gone down a lot. Fuck is now at the top, and shit has gone up a lot as well. The others have changed, and that bugger has sort of started to fade away. You might have guessed that sounds a little bit more old-fashioned these days, bugger. and a lot of the other words had sort of stayed at a fairly consistent frequency. Now, you might think, okay, fine, but so what? Who cares? Well, I think this is actually really interesting because this is only 20 years. But also, when you ask people what they think are the most serious or strongest swear words, people will still say the word fuck. And I'll return to that point in a moment. With corpus linguistics, if you have metadata about the people in your corpus, in this case, the speakers, if you know things about their identity, gender, age, etc., then you can start to chop up the data into different bits and compare over these different categories. So the gender distribution between male and female identifying speakers has shown a difference. Here you see in the blue that the male swearing rate was more or less a bit more than double the female swearing rate in the 90s. The difference is much smaller in the 2010s. So there's a question there to be asked about the relationship between swearing and gender. Something seems to be changing. Likewise with age, something seems to be changing. Yes, probably what you expected, that swearing is more common among younger adults and the rate decreases relative to age. That is true. There is a negative correlation between age and swearing rate. However, you'll notice that the blue mean, the line of best fit here, is more of a severe gradient than the red one, which is 2010. So blue is 90s and red is 2010. What that means is that the rate at which the swearing decreases over time is not as severe as it was in the 90s. So it is closer to horizontal, and of course horizontal would mean that there is no correlation either way. So the effect of age appears to have weakened a little bit between the 90s and the 2010s. So this idea of fuck being really common, you might think, well, yeah, people say it loads now. But also when you ask someone what are the strongest swear words, and the Office of Communications, which is a broadcasting regulator in the UK, ask the public quite regularly their opinions about many things that could be considered inappropriate to show at certain times on TV and radio, including swearing. People will say that fuck, motherfucker, and cunt are the three most offensive, i.e. least tolerated swear words. But yes, for certainly for cunt and potentially motherfucker, yes, those words are much less frequent, but fuck is actually the most common. So to me, there seems to be a mismatch, because the theory would go that the more common a word is, the more tolerated it is, and therefore the weaker it is in its strength. But there seems to be a mismatch here. And there you go, that you get these fascinating tables from Ofcom. You can find them online. They're brilliant. They give you all sorts of categorizations of what participants have said. I'd love to be a participant in one of these studies. It would be fantastic to kind of go through every single one of these hundreds of words and make judgments about them. I mentioned also that this work was picked up in the press last year, and there was some interesting reaction. So I wanted to share with you a few comments. Here we go, all maybe surprisingly or unsurprisingly from the Daily Mail. That's because English is a second language to many in the UK. So changes in swearing being attributed to them foreigners, so to speak. If anyone's missing the swearing, they've only got to watch TV or some so-called comedians. English amongst the younger generations has become more coarse, whereas before the 80s, swearing rarely used the FC or S words. I did not even hear one of those until I was in my 20s. What a load of rubbish. Bad language is worse than ever due to young people's ignorance of the English language. I was always taught the swearing was a sign of a diminished vocabulary. Many people use swear words in normal speech and could not string a sentence together without a few F's and B's. They don't even realize it's swearing. I would say that it is down to poor education and lack of discipline. But if the parents do it, what chance has a child got? And this is really just a few of many examples, and well beyond swearing as well, in many contexts, of this whole idea of language degrading over time. It is a really pervasive societal moral panic that has existed for centuries, that it's young people ruining language, and it's all getting worse, and things aren't like they used to be back in my day. And yet, despite the proclamations of these doom-mongering folk, we're still communicating as successfully as ever, and achieving our communicative goals with the language we're using now. And so there actually, from a scientific perspective, there is no actual evidence that English is somehow degrading, or in fact language in general. So to finish, I just want to ask you a few questions, and then we have a few minutes for a little chat before I pass over to Sue. Are your students allowed to swear at school, in the classroom? Would they, if they chose to, be allowed to investigate swearing? And we can chat about this in a minute. My perspective, being someone who wouldn't have any role in disciplining your students, would be that, yeah, I think like it's a part of language, and if your students are studying English language, then they should potentially be free to study any aspect of it they want within reason. And I'd say that there's enough evidence that swearing does a lot of useful things for us in society. So I'd say that yeah, go ahead, but I don't want to be accused of encouraging everyone to start swearing all the time. Just to finish, I want to, and I'm sure we'll be able to send out the slides afterwards, point you away to an online tool that I find to be quite useful for being able to easily and accessibly access corpus data and make searches. It's called BNC Lab. It's a free website. There's no registration or anything required. It just runs in a browser. It gives you access to samples from these 2 spoken corpora that I just mentioned. You can search for a word, and you can look at the frequency, you can look at examples, you can look at distribution and social categories. And the website even comes with worksheets for A-level, aligned to the A-level syllabus, and also teacher crib sheets as well that you can apply for access for too. So you may find that of interest if you're interested in searching for some naughty words yourself in corpus data. Okay, so to finish, I just say that, of course, the corpus part might not be so appealing to everybody. But there are lots of ways to look at swearing without looking at corpora. You can ask people what they think about swearing. Okay, you can ask them about their opinions about certain words, but you can also ask them about other people's opinions about swearing as well. You could look at the comments of newspaper articles about swearing. You could look at what people say about swearing in online fora, etc. So there's a lot you can do looking at swearing without necessarily looking at the data in this kind of systematic way that I've just demonstrated. Okay, so swearing, I'd say, is as legitimate a part of language as anything else. And there are ways now of accessing linguistic data sets for free online that I would argue are fun and accessible for students, and I'd encourage you to consider having a go if you haven't already. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Robbie. We've got a few minutes for questions before we hand over to Sue. Have we got any questions? If people want to put hands up or any questions in the chat, feel free. Got a comment there from Sarah in the chat.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it, to think about what you can actually do with that corpus data. Great. So yeah, Susie in the chat saying that she'd encourage a report or investigation into swearing. Really interesting. Yeah, it's definitely really interesting to think about how it's part of language. Well, it's language, a variety of language, of course, but also language change in that way, looking at it in longitudinal sense. Definitely. So I'm just checking if I can see any hands, any questions, any thoughts. Got a question from Georgie here. Interesting. Have there been many new swear words over the years? Have you got any thoughts on that, Robbie?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are, depends what you mean by new. I was thinking about this recently. A lot of new words are not necessarily completely new, but rather changes to existing words or reformulations of existing words. Certainly with fuck, for example, there's definitely been a lot of creative morphological adaptations, if you will. a lot of infixing where you get fuck put in between two other words, you know, fan fucking tastic, or blending of two taboo words together. So you have a pretty grim one, the fucktard, for instance, which has appeared recently. It brings in the question of actually the distinction between swearing and then other types of taboo language, because you'll notice I didn't really include slurs, for example. But there are definitely, we've seen recently, there are definitely words that very recently have become loaded, potentially, or indexing a minority group in a pejorative way, which arguably could be considered. I'm thinking specifically about two words. One is gammon, which in recent years has become a term that has been used to describe conservative white men, essentially. And you have a word like snowflake, or woke more broadly, which again in online discourse has become used as almost as a term of abuse. It's something that you'd accuse someone of being if you're trying to offend them, if you disagree with their views. And so, yeah, but again, these are words that already existed, but they've taken on new meanings, and that is a much more common process of change rather than the manufacturing of an entirely new word from scratch, which is much rarer.
Really interesting.
Okay, we've got lots of questions now.
Great. I suppose we've only got time maybe for one more. So I think the second one in the list was, have you got any thoughts on what changes attitudes as people age? So, you know, in terms of, do we inevitably become more prescriptive in our attitudes to language? Interesting.
That's a great question. It's kind of, I always think about, you know, people always say, oh, you become more conservative with age. Or maybe is it that the definition of what it means to be conservative changes around you and your views don't change? I'm not sure. I was thinking about this recently. You know, are there things that, as a relatively descriptive liberal linguist as I am, that I consider to be unproblematic, but will change around me over the next few decades, and suddenly I'll be the one complaining that this isn't right anymore, even though my own values are the same as they were? I think maybe it's more that society changes around someone and they don't necessarily change with it, rather than their own views changing. Not to excuse people who complain about young people ruining language. I hope I never become one of them. But I mean, yes, there is a correlation definitely with the people who get upset about changes are generally older people complaining about what younger people are doing. And I don't think that is exclusive to language. I think it is more a symptom of just generally how society works. And you generally get this discourse where older people, a higher proportion of older people are concerned about how things have changed compared to the proportion of younger people being concerned about how things are changing. And language is just part of society like anything else. So I think it's sadly natural. Not to excuse it though, because, you know, it can be damaging, and that's what a lot of this work looking at these discourses is concerned about, the limiting effects that these values can have, particularly if they're held by people who have power over other people. And it falls into the same category as accent discrimination, which is a really serious problem as well at the moment, and many others. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but I guess I'm trying to say that it's not really about language, actually. It's about society more broadly, and language is one kind of, I suppose, one output of society. But the people who worry about these things are not actually worried about language. It's usually something else.
Great, thanks, Robbie. Wish we could carry on this conversation for another half an hour, because there's some really interesting comments there in the chat, but we're going to have to move on. But thanks ever so much. Really, really interesting. So we're going to pass over now to Sue, who's going to be speaking about English as a global language. So are you able to share your screen there?
I am, I hope. Can you see that?
Brilliant. Yeah, that's perfect. We can see that.
I should just say that I'm not very good on Zoom either. And the last talk I gave, apparently I stopped sharing and I hadn't realised, and I don't know how long they let me carry on until somebody finally told me that they couldn't actually see my slides.
Okay, so, I'll stay
please
alert.
tell me immediately if that happens.
I will do. I'll stay focused. Great.
Okay. I'll try not to stop sharing them inadvertently. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here this afternoon, and thank you to Robbie. Always a very hard act to follow, but actually, I was listening with great interest, Robbie, because I know I know about your work on swearing, but I was interested to think actually how many similar themes I'm actually going to be picking up here, although from a completely different perspective, particularly around language variation and around the idea of degradation of language, if you like, but from a completely different perspective. So I'm talking about English as the global language, as Meg said, or please take thousands of salutations to your lotus feet. I'm a professor of applied linguistics, TESOL, teaching English to speakers of other languages. So my perspective, my point of view is from a TESOL perspective. But of course, I think concerns around English as a global language are of interest to anybody who's involved in the teaching of English language. This talk isn't based on my research, it's based on a big concern of mine, because I work in being in TESOL, of course, I work with a lot of international students who speak different varieties of English and come from that global family of English speakers, if you like. So the themes I'm going to be talking about come out of my interest in that area. So, but I'm going to start with a quick quiz. Just got 5 very quick questions, so pen and papers at the ready, or just think about it. So here's the first question. How many people in the world speak English? Most of them are multiple choice, so it's okay. How many people in the world speak English? Approximately 1 billion, approximately 1.5 billion, or approximately 2 billion? Second question. How many languages in the world are classified as endangered? Is it 500, 1,500, or 2,500? Question 3. Where do you find goose fathers, or goose daddies, as they're sometimes called? Is it Saudi Arabia, South Korea, or Spain? Question 4. Please take thousands of salutations to your lotus feet is taken from a poem written for a royal birthday, an inquiry about PhD study, or an essay in global English. And finally, question 5. How did English spread around the world? Was it through settler colonies, through slavery, through trade and exploitation colonies, or through globalization? Okay, so those are my 5 questions. Now, if we had a bit longer, I'd probably get everybody writing answers in the chat, but as it is, we'll whiz through the answers as well. So according to a 2019 British Council report, there are 1.75 billion people who speak English at a useful level. So I think actually the answer to this question is it depends, because whatever a useful level means. But of course, if we included children who are learning English at school, then that would probably go above 2 billion. If we're talking about people who use English on a daily basis regularly, then it might be a bit less. But of course, what's also interesting about this is that of those 1.75 billion, only about 360 million are considered what we might call native speakers. But I'll come back to this idea of native speaker a bit later. In terms of endangered languages, UNESCO has 5 categories of danger, which are listed here. Now, it's considered that just under 2,500 languages are actually in one of these categories, so are at some level of danger of extinction. And the picture is not great, it's a bit gloomy. Over the past century alone, around 400 languages have gone extinct, and estimates of what's going to happen to the remaining 6,500 range from 50% will be gone by the end of the century up to 90% will be gone. And of course, one of the causes of other languages disappearing is this global spread of, well, it's claimed to be this global spread of English. So this is potentially, of course, one of the impacts of the global spread of English. Now, I've put this in because I think it is an important point, but it would take a whole of another talk to do that. So this isn't an area I'm going to look at in any detail today, but it is potentially one of the consequences of the spread of English. Answer 3 is actually Korea. So goose daddies are a Korean phenomenon whereby families are being split up because of English. So mothers and children go to an English-speaking country, such as the United States or Australia or Britain, to enroll their children in school to be educated in English, and their fathers stay behind in Korea to earn the salaries, of course, which keep the families overseas. I presume they're called goose fathers because they migrate backwards and forwards. They travel backwards and forwards between the two countries. Now, in Korea, this is considered something quite a serious social phenomena. You know, the fact that families are split in order for children to learn English is considered quite a serious social phenomena that the government has actually tried to counteract, trying to improve the provision of English within country. But again, it shows the far-reaching and perhaps some of the more unexpected potential effects of the spread of English around the world. Now, answer 4, the thousands of salutations to your lotus feet, that was actually from an inquiry about PhD study. So it was, if you like, a normal, everyday, polite use of English from a student who was inquiring from Nepal. So an example of possibly Nepalese English. And I've put on the slide here, I've put MacArthur's model of Englishes, of the different varieties of English around the world, just to give an indication of how many different varieties are have been acknowledged or have been recognised in models such as this one. Now, I'm not actually going to comment on this model. I think it's problematic in many ways. I mean, what immediately stands out is what on earth is world standard English in the centre there. But it does give an idea of the way in which English has developed across the world and the variations of English, going back to what Robbie was saying about variations within British English, but the variations across the world as well. And finally, of course, question 5 was a trick question, as I'm sure you know. All 4 channels are responsible for the spread of English around the world, but they all lead to different variations of English, different types of English, different statuses of English, if you like. So settler colonization to places such as the United States, Australia, countries where the settlers stayed, they colonized and they stayed, and countries where English is considered to be the main language or the first language today. The second channel through slavery to, for example, the plantations in Jamaica, leading to the development of pidgins and Creoles, English-based pidgins and Creoles, of course. Channel 3 would be the trade and exploitation colonies. So these are the colonies where the colonizers eventually left, but of course left behind English as the official language in most of these countries. And these are countries like India, Nigeria, Kenya, and so on. And then finally, of course, is the most recent channel, the spread of English through globalization, which has led to English, of course, in places such as China, or, well, everywhere else, and most of the countries in the world, often given a big push by events such as the Olympics in Beijing, for example, which led to a huge investment in English, in teaching English in China. So this has led clearly to a very complex picture of English and Englishes around the world, and many attempts have been made to capture this. Perhaps one of the most common, and one that you may well be familiar with, is Cattrew's model. Now, in spite of the fact that this is nearly 40 years old, it's probably the one that is still, you see cited the most in the literature. And Cattrew divided English into 3 circles, what he called the inner circle, the USA, so these are the settler colonies, the USA, Australia, and of course Britain, UK as well. Then there's the outer circle, the settler colonies, places like India and Nigeria, And then the expanding circle, the countries where English has entered into the country via globalization, China, Russia, and so on. Cattrew developed this further, identifying 3 different types of English, that, if you like, and also the role that English plays in each of these circles. So your inner circle, you get English, what he called English as a native language, which is norm providing. It provides the norms to the other countries. You get the outer circle with English as a second language. So English, countries where English is generally an official language, in law, in government, for example. And these were considered to be norm developing countries. And then finally, you get your English as a foreign language countries, which Cattrew described as norm dependent. Now, as I say, although this model is very much cited still today, and it's quite useful, I think it's quite a useful way of thinking about English, there's a huge question for me about whether, and for many other researchers interested in this area, about whether this is actually a reflection of reality. Now, in fairness to Cattrew, you know, we're talking mid-80s, early 90s here. The world has changed an awful lot since then, in terms of English, as well as in other terms, of course. So in fairness to him, it's perhaps a bit harsh to criticise him from today's perspective, but I think it is important to consider, and this is something that can be quite a useful teaching tool, I think, as well, to consider the ways in which such models may not reflect the reality of today. And the ways in which I think this has become more of a concern is through the idea that models such as Cattrew's and MacArthur's, that puts that world standard English at the centre, kind of imply that there are that some Englishes are better than others, if you like. So all Englishes really are equal, but some are better than others. So it gives the idea that inner circle Englishes are legitimate varieties. These are the ones that everybody else should be following, or from which everything else derives. Whereas the outer circle and the expanding circle Englishes are somehow seen as more illegitimate. And of course, Pidgins and Creoles weren't included at all, so they're very much on the periphery. But research, particularly more recent research, has shown that this is a wrong assumption. So this is all kind of based on the idea that a mother language, in this case, if you like, probably British English, has actually given birth to all these daughter languages, as Mufwani put it, and that there's been no other intervention in between. And this has led, certainly in the past, but also very much today, and whilst I don't have Daily Mail quotes, I could probably find some if I went to look for them, around the idea that these varieties are somehow inferior, and are somehow, so that the expanding circle, the expanding circle, the English and the outer circle varieties are somehow inferior, and, as Quirk said in 1990, are as a result of some kind of failure of the education system, which hasn't managed to teach students correct English. Now, of course, this raises all sorts of issues around what correct English is as well. You know, I mean, even if we tried to define what British English is, it's very, very hard to define what it is. So there's all sorts of questions around that, of course. But today, it's much more common to, and I think much more accurate, to see world Englishes or different variations of English not as corruptions of a British norm, but as of complex and developed varieties in their own right. And varieties, Robbie was talking about descriptive linguistics, so varieties which should be studied and described in their own right. And that's what linguists have been doing. And looking, for example, at variations across pronunciation and spelling, grammar, vocabulary and idiom, and discourse style, so across all aspects of the language. So, for example, in pronunciation and spelling, there's very often a tendency for this to be pronounced, this in British English, to be pronounced or written dis. In grammar, for example, plural marking for nouns may not be used. The S on the third person used in British English is very often not used. different inflections and tenses are used. So for example, Indian English is often characterized by use of the present progressive for stative verbs. So things like I am thinking, or I am understanding, or I am knowing, for example. Vocabulary and idiom, very often there are examples of other languages, of vocabulary and idioms from other languages, which have been incorporated into the variety of English. And Nigerian English, I'll show you in a moment an example from Nigerian English, but also different politeness routines and pragmatic strategies. So there is variation in those across different varieties too. So here's an example from, for example, colloquial Singapore English, or Singlish as it's often called. Very common characteristic here with the discourse marker la on the end of a sentence. There's some great YouTube videos. I mean, you know, if you want to use something like this in class to draw students' attention to different varieties of global English, there's some great, there's a series of YouTube videos with 2 children who give lessons in colloquial Singapore English. And I haven't got them on the resources, but I'm very happy to send them to you if you're interested. Here is also an example of Nigerian English. So you can see the spelling here. We were talking about fada, the use of local words, boku, oga. This is actually from a poem. So this is literary, this is conscious literary use of Nigerian English, as opposed to daily communication. But I think it's a nice illustration of some of the characteristics of this variety of English as well. So one of the things I do with my students is to give them examples of the different varieties of English, get them to analyse the characteristics, recognise the features. I've actually given them examples of Pidgin dialogue, and then they've constructed their own dialogues in Pidgin, for example. So there are lots of things that you can do with text to draw students' attention to the variations, to the global variations in English, not just the local variations. The other aspect, so this is looking at varieties of English that have developed in different contexts. But of course, English as a global language is also an umbrella, if you like. And that's led to the recognition and the idea of English as a lingua franca. So English as a lingua franca is globally English used to communicate amongst people who don't share the same first language. And that is one of the most common uses of English in the world today, of course. So English as a lingua franca, unlike unlike the Englishes that I've talked about so far, actually has global ownership. And it's not a variety of English, it's more about a use of English. So it's a way in which English is used to meet the particular needs of those who are communicating. And therefore, the usage of English and the use of so-called non-standard forms are not errors. They're caused, there is some systematicity to it. And what's quite interesting is actually a lot of the features that have been identified in English as a lingua, in ELF, are very similar to the features that have been identified in variations in Englishes, such as Nigerian or Indian English. And that includes things, for example, like the S on the third person, which in many varieties of English and in English as a lingua franca has disappeared. And for very good reason. It has no purpose to be there. If anybody's ever taught English as English to speakers of other languages, what appears to be something very, very simple, like an S on the third person, is actually incredibly difficult to acquire. And although I'm not really a second language acquisition expert, I imagine that that's because it's meaningless. You know, the person is marked by the pronoun in English. We don't need an S to mark it. And ELF users are oriented towards content and towards their interlocutors. So they're not oriented to particular norms of English, but they're oriented to exploiting their linguistic resources to achieve some form of communicative success. So we have these two, if you like, developments in English, both the local in local variations, but also the global in English as a lingua franca. And I think this raises some really interesting questions, particularly around, for example, who is a native speaker? So we haven't got time to actually do this, but if you just think in your own mind just for a second, how do you define a native speaker of English? Today, this is extremely difficult to define. You can't define it by historical terms, geographical terms. And in fact, Pikeday, way back in 1985, in an article called "The Native Speaker is Dead," actually said that the native speaker exists only as a figment of a linguist's imagination. And of course, then if you can't define a native speaker, then we can't define a non-native speaker of English either. So again, I think these are concepts that are really interesting to talk to students about and to address with students. I mean, again, what I do with my own students is I actually ask them to try to define a native speaker and give them some time to do it. And then they start to realise just how difficult it actually is. And I'd just like to finish, because I'm running out of time, with two quotes actually. Now, I know this is a long quote, but I think it's worth taking the time to just look at, because what I've said raises really interesting, I think, and important questions about today, now, who actually owns English. The point that Widdowson makes here is that although the fact is, as he says, English is an international language, which today English is an international language, which means that nobody has custody over it. And he notes that so-called native speakers of English are very proud that the global language is English, but precisely because it is English, it means it's no longer theirs. It belongs to everybody. And he finishes quite nicely, I think, it's not a possession which they lease out to others while retaining the freehold. Other people actually own it. So again, these are, I think, very interesting ideas, and they're ideas certainly I use with my students, who, especially the international students, who find this a completely different perspective on how they'd always thought of English, having always considered native speaker English to be a superior variety. And just very quickly, I think this leads us on to some considerations about the future of English. For a long time, it was thought that English would simply be supplanted by Chinese as the next kind of global language, and it may be the case through history. The global language, the dominant language, has changed. But I think really we don't know. And as Maureen said, what happens to a language when it goes global, we do not really know. It may look like any other language, only bigger, or scale may do something new to it. What we do know is that when languages get very small, below a certain level, they disappear fast because there is no community to sustain them. When they get very large, they tend to spread themselves thinly and start diversifying. And that's what we saw, of course, in the phase with the development of the different Englishes. When they get enormous, and a lion's share of the use is as a lingua franca, this is uncharted territory. And it is precisely, I think, this uncharted territory that we are in at the moment with English. And it will be certainly fascinating to see how it develops in the future. So there's a few references. And thank you very much for taking the time and listening. And any questions, comments, reflections, observations?
Thank you so much for that, Sue. That was really fascinating. Thank you. So yeah, any questions in the chat? Let's see. We've got a question from Dan Clayton here. Do you think we're getting to the point with technology that some people have been predicting for decades, where we simply use apps to translate between languages? It's a really interesting question. What do you think, Sue?
I think now the use of apps is really, so rather than learning it, so the importance of learning English will diminish. I think that's a really interesting question, Dan. Do you know, because I have lots of so because it's slightly, well, no, maybe off topic, not really. lots of friends on Facebook from Ukraine, because we've had Ukrainian partners, and I've spent so much time on using the translation function to obviously to follow the debates and the ideas, and I think that's a really interesting point. There is no indication so far, certainly, that governments are making any moves towards reducing the pressure that they put on to learn English. I mean, the age at which children start learning English gets younger and younger around the world, and still gets younger and younger. But I think that's a really good point. That could well be the future eventually. I think we're a long way from that at the moment, but it could be, yes.
It's really interesting. Yeah, and there's just one more question in the chat, which just looks really interesting one to answer.
Henry.
To think about rather. Henry Walker asks, would it be fair to say that English as a lingua franca operates as another variety of English? Almost another language of its own. Really interesting.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question as well. There are linguists who argue that it is a variety, and particularly those who have studied the features. I mean, there are more and more researchers who are trying to study the features of English as a lingua franca and to identify the regularities. So, to try and codify it, if you like, to codify its features. And to describe it as a variety. And there are those who argue that it is a variety. There are those who argue that it's not. My own personal perspective on this is I think it's quite hard to see it as a single variety, because it's variation, because it's used in so many different contexts by so many different people and for so many different purposes. I think it's probably more useful to see it as a communicative tool rather than a particular variety.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much for that response, Sue, and for that talk. So we've had two really interesting talks today, so thank you so much